Of the many battle plans and war simulations drawn up during the Cold War, none came close to one that would have fueled the grit or sent chills to the foot soldiers on the front lines. This war plan was called 7 Days to the River Rhine, an elaborate blueprint detailing how the Soviet Union and its communist allies in the Warsaw Pact pictured a nuclear confrontation with the US and NATO. It was top secret, but was leaked to the public in the early 2000s, revealing how the Soviets had planned the war in the early 1960s. 7 Days to the River Rhine was the planned response in a potential scenario where the US and NATO initiated the first attack by nuking Poland and Czechoslovakia, both members of the Warsaw Pact. The plan was not merely for the consumption of military analysts or history experts for theoretical discussions. It was outlined for soldiers to carry out nuclear attacks across Europe in a calculated manner which would earn the Soviet Union an immediate and decisive advantage and dictate the manner of warfare that is conventional. The obvious target was reaching the River Rhine, one of Europe's most crucial rivers because of its political and economic value. Taking control of this strategic landmark gives the Soviets power over trade passing through the Rhine. But more importantly, this serves as a springboard to further Soviet conquests in Europe, much like Hitler did before the outbreak of World War II. While the war plan set the commander's sights on the Rhine within a week, 7 days foreshadows a potential march of the Red Army further west or south to the Mediterranean, or north to the seas of England and Norway. Current discussions of 7 Days to the River Rhine focus solely on enumerating its targets. However, a hypothetical day-to-day breakdown brings us inside the minds of the Soviet strategists and immersed in the week-long ravaging of Europe. On day 1, chaos beset Europe as NATO attacked Poland and Czechoslovakia with nuclear bombs. Within minutes, the Soviet Union and its allies pounded the major cities and military targets across West Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark with nukes. Transportation and communication lines were targeted, together with military installations. One of the very first targets was the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Without these, NATO forces were disoriented and disorganized. The main objective was to employ overwhelming attacks in a shock and awe manner that would quickly cripple NATO's major infrastructure and military capabilities to prevent any chance of US reinforcements. Failing at this would have subjected the Soviets to the immense technological power of the US military. Purposefully, the Soviets spared France and the United Kingdom from nuclear attacks, knowing that these countries had their nuclear arsenal and could potentially retaliate with an equal amount of destruction to the Warsaw Pact. On day 2, the Warsaw Pact's nuclear attacks intensified and expanded to include Italy. Key industrial centers were added to the list of targets. The strategy at this point was to cut NATO's supply chain and industrial capabilities and smash its remaining defensive backbone that was still holding out against Soviet advances. Having lost vital resources, NATO would not have been able to stage an effective NATO counterattack, even if they were able to regroup. Day 3 could be the bloodiest of the push to the Rhine. This was the day commanders applied everything they had learned from the military academies. Here, nuclear strikes paused to give way to full-scale ground operations supported by a fleet of Sukhois, MiGs, and Tupolevs. The horde of Soviet tanks and mechanized units, previously known to NATO soldiers only through battlefield rumors, came into full view as they swept across the plains of West Germany. These rolling steel fortresses stopped at nothing to make a decisive encirclement of the US headquarters in Frankfurt. To achieve this, considerable flanks were positioned to the north at Lahn and the south at Main. Meanwhile, a formidable portion of Soviet offense was deployed to the anticipated breach of the Fulda Gap. This advance was meant to deliver the final blow to the US main base in Frankfurt and destroy NATO's command and control structures. Alongside this, the Soviets addressed the neutrality of Yugoslavia, Austria, and Switzerland to make way for a ground attack on Italy. options of invading these countries were considered. Day 4 was marked by the Soviet Union-Warsaw Pact, consolidating their gains and intensifying attacks on Italy. Captured territories were tightly controlled, as reinforcements and other logistics also came in this time, to maintain the offensive posture and ensure a steady advance. On days 5 and 6, the Communists embarked on their final push to the Rhine River. They had their crosshairs set on the financial hubs in Dusseldorf, the industrial centers in Essen, the Western German capital of Bonn, and other key cities to the south, and cities bordering the Netherlands to the north. Extensive mopping-up operations were also carried out in the occupied territories to eliminate whatever remains of NATO defense and resistance. This phase ensured that Soviet control over these areas was realized, and the final push to the Rhine could proceed without much drag. On the last day, the Soviet forces finally reached the banks of the Rhine River and took full control of the cities along it. Clinching this crucial position gave the Soviets a great advantage in the Cold War. Dread would be delivered to the remaining Western European countries and even far beyond the Atlantic Ocean that the Soviets were poised to carry on the momentum and proceed with further attacks. How would the US and NATO have responded to such a barrage and overwhelming attacks? Some have dismissed the plan as completely unattainable, and yet others would argue that with the Soviets' plan of fast-paced, immense scale and shock-and-awe tactics, the best NATO could have aimed for was to slow the Soviet advance. However, it was strategically viable for the US and NATO to immediately shift the command headquarters away from the front lines, possibly between fellow NATO stalwarts France or the UK. From there, the NATO leadership would have taken stock of the current situation, reorganized its troops, and planned to re-establish communications with the rest of their forces. Civilians would have been evacuated, including the families of US personnel in Germany. Because US reinforcements were paramount, alternative landing sites and methods would have been identified in the European mainland. Options would have been France or any NATO member that has a naval port or coastline in the least affected areas. It was expected that the US and NATO would have made a heroic defense of the Fulda Gap to prevent the swift advance of the Soviets towards the major US base in Frankfurt. Every soldier would have fought tooth and nail, and had made sure that every single bullet, every tank and artillery shell, and every aircraft bomb would have hit a Soviet target. Part of the US-NATO defense was to carry out strike operations on isolated Soviet units, or attempt to break through the rear flank. If the Soviets had been able to breach neutral Yugoslavia, Austria, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland in order to attack Italy, then NATO could have passed through Sweden and Finland to strike at Leningrad and possibly disrupt the Soviet momentum. The same would have been done with an attack from Greece and Turkey in the south, although this would have had a lesser impact due to the distance from the front lines. Also, NATO submarines could have been pushed to their limits in the face of a war being fought from a distance. As new battle lines were drawn every day, NATO would have been pushed west from the River Rhine and would have entrenched itself at the western borders of Belgium and made a final stand for France. Having assessed that the Soviets were on a strategic offensive and may lead to a possible occupation of Europe, US NATO would have prepared for a prolonged war and activated Operation Gladio. This was a secret plan created at the onset of the Cold War and involved even the Mafia and the Vatican. The plan was to organize around 5,000 to 15,000 stay-behind secret paramilitaries to conduct guerrilla strikes including sabotage, assassinations, false flag operations, and other types of resistance in the event of a Soviet takeover of Europe. 7 days to the River Rhine may not have been the war plan of an aggressor, as it was a reaction to a potential nuclear first strike by NATO. But it was the wickedness of how the Soviet Union would have responded that shocked the world. The war plan revealed an adversary with no qualms about a full-scale commitment of military resources that dangerously treads the borders of World War III. The whole strategy may be argued as the Soviets' quick preventive response to a conflict that could have escalated into a full-blown nuclear war. They sought to achieve this by employing the same nuclear method, but on a relatively smaller scale. At the first moment of the enemy's nuclear strike, a savagely fierce counterattack razed their territories to the ground, and the Soviets prevailed on the tactical gains to force a conventional war. Throughout Cold War discussions, the Soviets' sheer numbers were a recurring concern for NATO. At the same time, the terror of U.S. superior technology loomed over the Soviets. This was again manifested in the 7 days to the River Rhine, emphasizing why NATO needed to stop the attacks early on, and for the Warsaw Pact to prevent U.S. reinforcements from the mainland. Secret war plans were not exclusive to the Cold War, as they were regular matters in most militaries throughout history and contemporary affairs. Aside from Operation Gladio, there was the U.S. nuclear counterattack blueprint called Oplan 10-2. Recently, a German war plan against Russia surfaced in 2024. Before this, a 2023 memo from a U.S. general broke the news to expose a potential war with China that could erupt in 2025. All these reflect the underlying power struggles among nations throughout history. Although 7 days to the River Rhine never came about, the unspoken threat of a major conflict remains alive. With the recent leaks of war scenarios and strategic assessments involving the same protagonists, the dynamics of the Cold War may just be on the brink of resurrection.